So it wouldn't surprise me at all if more than a few people were looking at the title of this video thinking this is an unnecessary topic on the face of it. So forgive me, but I want to double down on that a little bit and explain why I think this is actually a really important topic to be discussing. And I think it starts by recognizing that God took great pains to make the incarnation happen. Literally, he exposed himself to excruciating suffering and death so that the otherwise invisible God could be made visible to us. And this is the pattern throughout our faith, to make the otherwise invisible visible to us who are sensory, physical beings. That's why we have sacraments at the end of the day, to make the medicinal saving work of God and his grace tangible to us through sensory signs and experiences. So given what God was willing to do to be more accessible to us, don't you think that we owe it to him to spend some time contemplating the incarnation and what it means that God became human? That's what this reflection that I'm trying to offer here is about, because there are a lot of traps set for us when we try to do that. For example, it can be really easy for us to think about Jesus in ways that we prefer rather than what makes the most sense or what is revealed to us in Scripture. And in noting that, it's interesting to me that in researching this topic and reading what other contemporary writers had to say about it, every attempt to answer it that I came across settled on the conclusion that yeah, of course, Jesus would have laughed. And if I'm being honest, that's a more pleasing answer to me. That makes me feel good. It makes me feel like Jesus is more like me, because I like to laugh and have a good time. And in concluding that Jesus was the same, I can feel better about myself. But I think it's really important for us to be wary of our willingness to treat Jesus more like a fulfillment of our desires and less like someone who actually exists and who we need to encounter in order to be changed ourselves. So can I make this invitation that we be as honest as possible as we do some of the difficult work in contemplating who Jesus actually was and is, and what that means for us who need his help and grace to become more like him. And we have to admit, that's a sharp admission that there are going to be some serious distinctions between him and us. One last clarification I need to make is that I'm limiting this question to whether or not Jesus would have ever laughed through humor, whether he would have found something humorous and then that led to laughter. I have no doubt that he would have experienced spontaneous eruptions of joy that might have led to something like laughter, but amusement through humor leading to laughter is something different, and that's the question that I'm interested in here. Now, whenever I ask questions like this, I find that the typical immediate reaction is to appeal to the fact that Jesus was fully God and fully human. And since human beings do fill in the blank, in this case, laughter, then of course he too would have exhibited that trait. But unfortunately, our question isn't quite that simple. In answering that way, we're basing our understanding of what a human is by our familiarity with ourselves and the people that we encounter in our everyday lives, because those are the only human beings that we know of. But the problem with that is that those are all examples of fallen human beings. What we're doing here is asking, what does the perfect human being look and act like? There are a lot of things that human beings do that the perfect human being would never do. Yes, Jesus is fully God and fully human, but he's not fully fallen human. What we are contemplating is the perfect sinless human. And that's a little more challenging. So in trying to make some headway in this question, I think it's really important for us to try to define what humor is, which is unfortunately a lot easier said than done. But let me try to give it a shot. I would define it as the realization and encounter with the absurdity of oneself and the external world and other people that you know, and a response to that realization characterized by humility and maybe even a little hope. That could probably be refined a little bit, I would admit, but I think it gets us close enough so that we don't have to get stuck on it and we can try to move on and come to some sort of conclusion about this. The key thing that I want to emphasize here, though, is absurdity. All good comedy, whether it be situational, anecdotal, or even slapstick, reveals some kind of absurdity worth laughing at. It's what happens when you examine yourself and maybe your situation and you realize it's ridiculous. And you can either laugh at it, which is humor descending from hope and humility, or you can cry descending from despair. Now, if you can agree that absurdity is the key ingredient here, then I would like to propose a conclusion, which is only an imperfect being is conscious of their own absurdity, because a perfect being is not absurd. They are exactly what they are supposed to be. And because we are imperfect, our response towards our own imperfection tends to be naturally imperfect. What we most often seem to do is to try to compensate for our imperfections and our weaknesses. We erect these false exteriors and facades and personas. We spray ourselves with perfume. We wear makeup. We boast about our successes and try to hide our failures. Just like look at our resumes, for example. The moment we get the opportunity to describe ourselves, we tend to boast about the things that we could brag about, and we tend to avoid admitting our faults and our weaknesses. In the face of our own imperfections and our insecurities, we can either laugh at ourselves or we can compensate by taking ourselves too seriously. And I'd say that that's where insecurity comes from. It comes from the fact that we've installed this false exterior around ourselves in the form of a lie. That the lie specifically is that we are better than we actually are, and we become fearful and insecure that something or someone might expose that lie. And that's exactly what embarrassment is. It's when the false facade that we've erected comes crashing down and everyone can see our own imperfections while still hiding behind their own false exteriors. And it's pretty easy to think of examples of this. How about tripping and falling down, which I've never experienced myself, but I've heard it's quite embarrassing. In that moment, everyone else is still stable on their feet and able to act like they would never suffer such a fault. But you are the only one who has been exposed as not perfectly in control of your physical faculties. Or what about spilling food on yourself while you're eating? In that moment, you're apparently the only idiot who needs a bib. Or what about when you say the wrong thing? One of my favorite comedians is a guy named Brian Regan, and most of his jokes are about saying or doing the wrong thing at the wrong time and feeling stupid for it. The best kind of comedy and humor is when someone has that unique ability to bring all of our false exteriors down simultaneously so that we can all experience the relief of recognizing our own true absurdity and then just laughing together about it. That's what happens in like a stand-up comedy scenario. It's when a comedian can stand up there and identify all the weird absurdities that are inherent in human life, and we can all simultaneously just experience the relief of laughing about it together. Humor is a medicinal antidote to our own imperfection and insecurity. And the reason I say this is the best kind of humor is because it allows us to be honest with ourselves, and because the effect is the virtue of humility. That's what a good stand-up comedian or a good joke can do. Again, it brings relief to our relentless effort to try to avoid embarrassing ourselves. And that hints at the dark side of comedy as well. Comedy at its worst, I think, takes on two forms. The first is when it tries to make something that is not absurd look absurd, like God or the sacred. Jokes at the expense of God aren't just irreverent, they're false. If good humor is about exposing the absurd, then God, who has no imperfections and therefore no absurdity, cannot be exposed in this way without resorting to calumny. The second way in which humor goes bad is when it's directed towards the imperfections of others in a discriminatory way. So what I mean by that is when one person or group's imperfection is exposed while the imperfections of others are left unmolested. Like, imagine if someone with a disability was surrounded by a group of people who don't suffer that same affliction and was mercilessly ridiculed for the amusement of those people. This kind of humor is merely mean-spirited, and far from producing humility in everyone that participates in it, it selectively humiliates some while affirming the undeserved pride of others. And this is why I would answer the question of this video, and brace yourselves, by saying that Jesus likely would not have laughed as a result of humor, because he was a perfect being and had no need to be brought low by recognition of his own absurdity. And he would never have laughed at the absurdity of others at their expense, like in the previous example, because, well, he wasn't a jerk. Now, with that said, I could entertain an argument that says that Jesus might have laughed at a joke or an amusing situation for our sake, like like a parent who feigns amusement at a child's joke, but that it's not actually funny. So in his case, it wouldn't have been because he actually spontaneously found it amusing himself. I think it's also helpful and definitely important to note that the Gospels never record Jesus laughing. They do portray him showing other kinds of human emotions like weeping, but this makes sense because the human condition is sort of a sad thing to observe, and his compassion would arouse that sorrow in him. But to laugh at the human condition when you don't share in its absurdity or its imperfections would be to ridicule it. It's also interesting to note that in the Gospel of Judas, which is a heretical Gnostic gospel, Jesus does laugh a lot, and it's always mean-spirited and at the expense of others. This also helps me, I think, to understand why Jesus condemns laughing in the Beatitudes. I always thought of that as being kind of harsh, like what's wrong with laughing? But if you understand the context in which he's comparing different groups, like the rich and the poor, the hungry and the full, then I think we can understand that this is a comparison of those who are laughing at the expense of others while refusing to acknowledge their own imperfections and absurdities. It's the bad kind of humor contrasted with the good kind in which everyone can recognize their own imperfections and their own absurdity and allow their false exteriors to come crashing down, bring them to a humble kind of laughter. And this I would consider to be a very, very good thing and something that produces very good fruits. Laughter and humor are good for us because of our imperfections, but for the one who is perfect, it doesn't make any sense that he would laugh at the same kinds of things that we do, except to make him more relatable to those who are imperfect. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.